All right, I'm ready to introduce. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books presents award-winning journalist Sherry Boschert to discuss the stellar and moving tribute to Title IX's 50 years of gender equity progress in schools. 37 words, Title IX and 50 years of fighting sex discrimination. You can order a copy of 37 words from Left Bank Books to support authors and independent bookstores. We will have signed copies available for anyone watching online, and those will be available to order on our website, and I will share the direct link. Sherry Boschert is an award-winning journalist and the author of Plug-in Hybrids, the cars that will recharge America. Among her many honors, she received a Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Professional Journalists for her efforts to promote equity within the news industry. She lives in New Hampshire. A sweeping history of the federal legislation that prohibits sex discrimination in education, published on the 50th anniversary of Title IX. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Those are Title IX's first 37 words. Lucy Jane Bledsoe, the author of No Stopping Us Now, says, "I'm mightily impressed by the breadth and volume of Boschert's research and her ability to craft it into a compelling read. 37 words is a history, but it's also a roadmap for what it will take to go forward. It's a really important book." And Noreen Farrell, the executive director of the Equal Rights Advocates, says, 37 words is a stellar and moving tribute to Title IX's 50 years of gender equity progress in schools. The book centers the champions behind this landmark law, the authors and advocates, survivors and athletes, and every student breaking gender stereotypes to reach their dream. Well-researched and brimming with hope, the book is an inspiration for our continued fight for gender justice for all. And without further ado, I would like to welcome I'm very excited, Sherry Boschert.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am so delighted to be here at Left Bank Books in St. Louis. My family comes from St. Charles on my father's side, so we have history here. But it's really lovely to be in a queer-friendly space with fabulous books, and I encourage everyone here to come on down and check it all out. And of course, look for a copy of my book. So what is Title IX, and why should you care? I mean, if anyone's watching and listening, you probably know Title IX, or you wouldn't be here. But more than half of the U.S. population has never heard of it, and it's probably the most significant civil rights law for women that exists today. This is its 50th anniversary. It was a law passed in 1972 to prohibit sex discrimination in education. Now, people of my generation, I'm 66, if they know it at all, they know it usually as the law that got girls into sports, because most sports did not exist for girls in schools before Title IX. But if you talk to college students today, if they know Title IX, they usually know it exclusively as the law that deals with sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus. Title IX is that and everything in between, and so much more. Excuse me. It started out, actually, when a woman named Bernice Resnick Sandler, her nickname was Bunny, she was getting a doctorate degree in education. And she wanted to be a professor. She wanted to teach. She was good at it. She liked it. And she could not get a job. Her University of Maryland had 8 openings for tenure track positions, and she couldn't even get an interview. And at first, she just thought it was her fault. But she eventually figured out, no, something bigger is going on here. And in 1969, when this was happening, the term sex discrimination was just beginning to be widely used. Bernice Sandler loved to say, you need to name a problem to change it. and that problem was being named. We as a society didn't collectively decide on the phrase sexual harassment until the late 1970s. Once it got named, it was easier to point to it and to act on it. Sandler in the 1980s helped spread the term gang rape. No one, that was described different ways. And when you can talk about gang rapes in fraternities or by sports teams or whatever, it's easier to address it and for people to understand it. And of course, that's gone on as society progresses. I mean, today, a lot more people understand concepts like transgender, cisgender, intersex, non-binary, and not that those are problems, but discrimination against people who fit those categories is a problem. But if we couldn't name that before, it was much harder to deal with it. So I tell the story of Title IX through three main characters to keep you turning the page, basically. And I've told it as a page turner. The first is Bernice Sandler, because through her actions, and I don't want to give away too much, but she helped lead to the legislation that became Title IX. And then there's Pamela Price, who in 1977 was the key plaintiff in the first lawsuit under Title IX dealing with sexual harassment and assault at Yale, called Alexander v. Yale. She and 4 white women students and 1 gay male professor sued Yale, and the first judge to get the case threw out all of the plaintiffs except Pamela Price on technicalities. And that left 1 young black woman against a white male professor in terms of the judge deciding who was telling the truth here. You can imagine in 1978, that didn't go well. She lost the case, but for the first time, a judge said, yes, Title IX does cover sexual harassment and assault. Now, that doesn't make sense intuitively to some people, but what happens is if you're a student or faculty and you get sexually assaulted or harassed and you develop PTSD or you can't concentrate or you have to see the person who assaulted you in your dorm or in your class or on campus, a lot of people end up dropping out and they lose access to their education. That's why it's sex discrimination. If the administrators don't do something about it and they just cast you off, that's not fair. So that's how Title IX applies to that. So there's Bernice Sandler, who tells the story of jobs and the whole history of Title IX, because all of my 3 main characters, their lives intersected with Title IX almost for the whole past 50 years. Pamela Price on sexual harassment and assault, and Diane Milutinovich at Fresno State University in California. And through her, I tell the story of athletics. It is ongoing, as all of these issues are, but I particularly liked telling the story through her because a lot of Title IX history deals with elite East Coast universities or the Washington, D.C. halls of power. Fresno State is in a more rural, much more diverse, and socioeconomically diverse area. And so I could show how Title IX played out there. So those are the 3 main characters. And then there's some minor characters in the last decade, the young activists who made the issue of sexual assault on campus an issue that filled headlines and continues today. And of course there's others. I mean, so those are the 3 main characters, but there's a cast of millions, because what I hope that the book does is it shows the movements, that the social justice movements that brought us Title IX, and then used Title IX as a tool to further those movements. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, disability rights movement, LGBTQ rights movement, any of those, Title IX fits. The movement against sexual violence, they're all intertwined. And there's, of course, millions of people in those movements. All of us listening here, we are part of Title IX's history, because somewhere in your education, Title IX touched you, whether you know it or not. It opened doors, it opened opportunities. And of course, today it's in headlines because this is an election year. The election is next week. And there's a lot of anti-trans rhetoric around transgender athletes and such. It is educational to know Title IX's history, to apply some of the dilemma in the 1970s when they were figuring out the regulations for allowing any women into sports. What does that look like? What's fair? It wasn't a given that it was going to be divided between men's and women's sports. That was just one option. And today that seems like less of a logical option because we know it's not binary. How do intersex students fit into that? So if you can look at all of the arguments on both sides in the 1970s and apply them today, hopefully we won't repeat some of the mistakes of the past. It's a fascinating story in that respect. But Title IX covers even more. It's not just colleges, it's K through 12, and it's what we used to call vocational education, but now I think it's called career and technical education. I mean, I like to say, in this era of climate change, electricians will save the world. We need electricians to build the solar power, build the wind power, expand our electrical grid. And if we're only training boys and men to be electricians, we're missing out on half the workforce that we need to save the world. And that's happening a lot. Only 2% of US electricians are female. So we have a long way to go in that respect. So there's national trends, but I just want to throw out a few local statistics to give you an example of how it's an ongoing situation in athletics. I mean, athletics isn't even mentioned in Title IX, but almost as soon as it passed, the coaches and administrators of men's sports freaked out. Like, what do you mean we have to share our resources? We don't want to do that. So there was a lot of pushback and a lot of battles in Congress with people trying to kill Title IX or weaken Title IX. But it also became very popular because some of the first lawsuits were from fathers of athletically talented girls who wanted their daughters to have the same opportunities their sons did. And it became very popular. By 1979, women were a majority of college students, where they had been kept out arbitrarily before Title IX. Today, something like 10 times more high school girls play sports than did in 1972. The percentage of women playing NCAA sports has increased from something like 15% before Title IX to about 44% today. But really, that should be more than 60% because based on enrollments, that's how many positions should be given to women based on their numbers in the student population. But locally, almost if you look at any university, you can find imbalances. We're not there with Title IX yet. We've made great progress, but there's still a ways to go. I was impressed when I looked up the data. There's a law called the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act, which was passed in the 1990s by 2 Black women in Congress, that says every college and university in the country has to post annually their numbers for athletics. How many men and women are playing? What do we pay our coaches? Who gets those jobs? What do we spend on the teams? So you can find this information online very easily. We don't yet have that law for high school. And so there are great imbalances in high schools, but until we get an EADA law for high school, it's so hard for anyone to get the data and file a complaint. But on college, I was impressed with St. Louis. I just looked at the 3 largest universities here. Washington University, which is the biggest with more than 7,000 undergraduates. 52% of those undergraduates are women. And on their sports teams, 52% of the athletes are women. I have not seen that before, and I've looked at a lot of EADAs, so kudos to you, St. Louis University, Washington University. There are some imbalances. Their head coaches, 6 of them are men, 3 of them are women. That was one of the unexpected side effects of Title IX. Before Title IX, about 90% of coaches of women's teams were women. But once it became clear that they couldn't get rid of Title IX, and it was so popular it was never going to go away, the NCAA took over and men moved into those jobs. They spend half of the recruiting dollars for women, which is pretty good compared to other colleges. It should be 52%, but 50% is not bad. And the team spending, the women get about half of the money spent on teams. So the recruiting numbers are similar. So Washington University, doing really well. St. Louis University, the next biggest, 6,800 undergraduates. 62% of them are women, but only 56% of athletes are women. So you're missing 6% there. You're missing 22 playing slots that women should be getting at the university that they're not getting. You might say that's not a big deal, but when you add those up at college after college, nationally, the nonprofit group Champion Women points out that that translates to 200,000 chances to play that women aren't getting that they deserve under Title IX. It adds up to $162 million for recruitment that aren't going to women that legally should be, and nearly $1 billion in athletic scholarships that could help keep women in school, that should be going to women athletes that aren't because of these little and sometimes not so little discrepancies at schools. St. Louis University, they have 10 men head coaches and 4 women. They pay the head coaches of women's teams only 22% of what they pay the head coaches of men's teams. I could go on. There's, only 45% of the recruitment dollars go to women's teams. Again, imbalances of the total expenses, 43% go to women. And remember, they're 62% of undergraduates. Lastly, and I'll stop with the numbers, the University of Missouri St. Louis, 4,600 undergraduates, 58% are women. 50% of their athletes are women. That's not too far off, but you're missing some there. Head coaches, the pay for women's teams is actually higher. So even though University of Missouri St. Louis isn't quite giving the playing slots to women, they pay the head coaches of women's teams higher. I haven't seen that anywhere else. This was new to me, so kudos to them. The same for assistant coaches. They're paying them more on the women's teams. Athletic student aid, which are the scholarships, 57% of them go to women, which is pretty proportional to what they are in the student body. So all in all, St. Louis universities are doing great. I have no complaints here. When I pull these stats out in other cities, they're much, much worse. So we do still have to keep paying attention to that. Lastly, I do want to touch, since it is election season, I want to touch a little bit again on the issue of transgender athletes. Title IX from the beginning was all about inclusion, not exclusion. Women were being excluded from graduate schools. Law schools routinely limited women in admissions to 9% of their admission slots. You could hardly get into medical school. Title IX said you have to include everyone. We're not about excluding. And one of the earliest complaints under Title IX was the men's swim team at the University of Washington. They said, hey, the girls team gets hair dryers. How come we don't? Like, you're right. Let's even it up. Let's make it fair. When they were discussing in the 1970s how to include women in athletics, the feminists were split, as there is some split in feminists today about what's the best way to include transgender athletes. And back then, the ACLU and the National Organization for Women, they both believed, having come out of the civil rights movement, that separate could never be equal. And so they wanted to find a way that it wouldn't be separate. But how could it be fair if girls didn't have the upbringing that boys did to get skilled at athletics, to learn how to play on a team, to build their bodies? if they had to just try out for a team, they would lose out to men or boys often. So they came up with different schemes, like, well, what if instead of dividing it by sex, we divide it based on height or weight or other factors? Or what if we use sort of the Olympic model, where you could have men's and women's teams or different kinds of teams from each university, and then they compete against each other and you add up their scores. So the university with the highest score would be the winner. That's an incentive to invest fully in both men's and women's teams or whatever teams you put together. They didn't get that. There was a big pushback again from men's teams who didn't want Title IX to succeed at all. They were pushing the Office for Civil Rights to just leave football out of the equation, or just weaken Title IX. And so the ACLU agreed to step aside because other feminists felt that if we don't get some regulations now, we're going to have another decade when girls and women can't play sports. So they agreed to step aside, now kept fighting, but lost. And the one thing that they wanted that I think might have made a difference, but they didn't get, is an off-ramp. Okay, let's try it this way, but let's revisit this in 5 or 10 years or 15 years, whatever, just to see if this still makes sense as the best way to organize sports. They didn't get that. So 50 years later, here we are. We still have men's and women's teams. We still have imbalances. And now we're finally dealing with the fact that, the binary of men and women just doesn't cover all students. And if we as a society feel that athletics are an important part of education, it has to be accessible to everyone. It's inclusion. If you want to take sports out and make them professional, make them a job, that's different. But in education, everyone should have access to education. So that's my starting point. And if anyone is saying transgender students shouldn't be allowed to be in locker rooms or playing sports teams, I want to hear from them, what's your plan for inclusion then? I'm not hearing it out there. All I'm hearing is exclusion. That's not Title IX. That's not legal. And hopefully after the election, things will be clearer and we can move forward on this issue. So that's it. That's me. I just want to, do we have a question?
Yes. So charter schools in Missouri have been recently very politicized. And I think that they are pushing to get more charter schools, and this might have on nationwide as well. But do you think that because they do not accept the public funds, that this is potentially one way of these schools working around Title IX and the political implications that might have?
So the question was, there are some charter schools that don't accept public funding, and thus Title IX doesn't apply to them because Title IX says no discrimination in federally funded education. And almost all schools are, but some are not. And I should say those first 37 words after which my book is named, after the first 37 words of Title IX, there's several pages of wording that are exceptions. Like no discrimination, except you can discriminate here and you can discriminate there and we'll let you do it over here. One of those exceptions is religious schools, if they can get a waiver, and they used to have to at least write a letter saying, this is how that conflicts with our religious beliefs. Today, thanks to President Trump, they don't even have to do that. They just say, we want an exception. So they may not even really be a religious school, but they could get an exception. But back to your question, let's say a school doesn't get federal funding. That has come up before. In fact, one of the key Supreme Court cases in 1980 called Grove City College versus Bell. They said, we don't get federal funding, except in scholarships, financial aid, that does. But so we're arguing that Title IX should only apply to the specific department that gets federal funding. And almost all schools do get some financial aid. Well, by then, President Reagan was in office and his Justice Department did not argue vigorously for Title IX, and the Supreme Court said, okay, we'll buy it. It only applies to that whatever specific department. That eviscerated Title IX in the 1980s because sports teams don't get federal funding. So suddenly Title IX didn't apply to them. The Office for Civil Rights had to drop several investigations of sexual assaults because if you were assaulted in the English building, which got built with federal funding, they could look into it. But if you were assaulted in the economics building, which was built without federal funding, too bad, you're out of luck. So for at least 4 or 5 years in the 1980s, not only Title IX was eviscerated in education, but so were all the other civil rights laws. Because Title IX, let me back up 1 second, it wasn't even supposed to be a separate law. Originally, it was supposed to just amend Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits in broad swaths of society, not just education, prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. And they were just going to add the word sex. That didn't happen for lots of intriguing reasons that you can read in my book. And they made Title IX a separate law applying just to education. And it set a pattern. So after that, Section 504 on disability discrimination was a separate law with the same 37 words. All of them used the same 37 words borrowed from Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The age discrimination law in 1977, same thing in its silo. And that has ramifications today because if you try to deal with intersectional discrimination, I mean, did someone discriminate against me because I'm a woman or a lesbian? Or let's say a woman of color. It's both. You can't unhook those. But often on campuses, there's different offices and different rules and different regulations depending on what kind of discrimination, and you have to choose. It's not reality. All of these constituencies came together in a grand coalition in the 1980s to pass in Congress the Civil Rights Restoration Act of 1988. And that got all these laws back in force. So a lot of people don't even know that happened. But it is a lesson that we can lose these laws. We have to protect them. And coming full circle now, there is a bill that's in Congress that has passed the House and is stalled in the Senate called the Equality Act. And it would do what Title IX wanted to do in the very beginning, which is amend Title VI of the Civil Rights Act by adding sex and gender. And if we can get that passed, Title IX will be taken care of. And it'll apply, again, not just in education, but in housing, public services, broad swaths of society. So the story is ongoing. And if schools don't get federal funding, they don't have to follow Title IX. But now with social media, students can talk to each other and say, this is not a friendly school, or give each other advice. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Sherry. All right, and for everyone joining us online, thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you again really soon. Have a good night, everyone.